Hello everyone, and welcome to Let's Print Something. This is the tutorial series where I'll be teaching you everything you need to know to get started with either FDM printing or resin printing. Now, in this episode, I'll be teaching you specifically how to install Cura and how to import your printer so that you can get started with it. I'll give you a basic overview of how Cura works so that you can kind of get started with it. Also, by the way, I continuously call it Cura. I have tried to break that habit, but I just can't. I know it's more likely pronounced Cura, but I can't stop myself. So sorry for that. But I'll be teaching you everything you need to know to get started with it. But in this tutorial series, I will have two separate playlists. One playlist will be for FDM printing and one will be for resin printing. So if you're here because you're looking for resin printing information, then you're on the wrong playlist. But if you're here because of a need for FDM printing knowledge, you've come to the right place. So, all right, let's get started. So if you click the link that I have included in the video description down below, it'll take you to this page here. You're just going to click on download for free. Then you're going to click on your operating system. Now, I've only ever used Cura on a Windows system, so that's what I'm going to be explaining here today. If you are using a Mac system or a Linux system, you can certainly reach out to me and I can try to help as much as I can. I would assume that the program will work pretty much the same after it's installed, but as far as the install process, it might be slightly different. But anyway, so I'm going to click on Windows because that's what I'm using. Then I'm going to hit download now. And now this will bring up a file explorer. This is the same thing that we talked about in last video. If you did not watch the first video, I do recommend that you go back and watch that because I am trying to create these videos so that they are going to be something that you watch from the first video onwards. They kind of build from the ground up. So each video is going to kind of build upon the skills that you learned in the last video, and then once you get to the end, you're going to have a pretty good set of, or a good framework to kind of build off of to increase your knowledge and to keep going with your building or your 3D printing knowledge. So if you didn't watch the last video, then go ahead and check that out and then come back to this. But if you already know how this works or you don't need the information that's covered in that video, then by all means, continue watching. So I'm going to click on desktop because that's where I want it to go, and I'm going to hit save. And then once that's done downloading, we're going to double click on it. Should bring up a window that looks something like this. We're going to hit yes. And then next on the next page, and then read through all of their license and user agreements, then hit I agree. And now here you can specify a specific location where you want it to be installed. I'm going to let it go with the default. If you have enough knowledge that you know where you want this to go inside of your Windows file directory, then by all means, set it to where you want it to go. Otherwise, the default location is perfectly fine. So you can just hit next. Again, I'm not going to change the defaults here. I'm just going to hit next. And now on this page, there are a couple of different options you can go through, and you can choose specific types of files that you want Cura to be able to open. You can initiate these later if you decide that you need them, but again, for now, I'm going to stick with just what it has set as default here and hit install. And then once that's done, you can just hit finish. All right, so now here's where we're actually going to get into getting Cura set up. So you're going to hit get started, take a quick read through their user agreement and hit I agree. And then here they're just explaining what's changed from the previous version to this version. So you can read through it if you want, or you can just go ahead and hit next. And from here they're asking to collect some user data from you so that they can try to improve their product a little bit. So if you feel uncomfortable with that, or if you want more information, you can click down here. It's pretty minimal, so I'm not that worried about it, so I'm going to click next. Now from here you can either create an account or sign into one. If you don't already have an account, I would recommend getting one. It is nice to have. You can do some things like backing up information, and you can log into it from different computers so you can kind of keep your configurations across multiple different platforms or multiple different computers. So I would recommend getting one, but if that's not something that interests you right now, then go ahead and hit skip. And then once you get to this window, you can finally add your printer. So I'm not going to go over any of the options here on top because they're a little bit more of an advanced technique. So eventually we will get into that, but for right now we're going to focus on add a non-network printer. So we're going to click on that tab, and it's going to open up all these different options here. And this is where it's really helpful to know the manufacturer of your printer and not just the model number. For example, if I go down to, this is going extremely slow. But anyway, if I go down to Creality 3D and then drop that tab open, this is where I would find the Ender 3. So if you're looking for just the Ender 3 on that the arcing list, then you're not going to actually be able to find it. So you have to open up the tab for Creality 3D to be able to find the Ender 3. And if your printer is not listed on here, don't worry. There are some workarounds and some things that you can do to add a custom printer. So if you do run into that, if your printer is not supported yet by Cura, then feel free to reach out to me either in the comments down below, or you can join the Facebook group, or just find me on Facebook. Feel free to send me a message and I will happily help you work around that. So I'm going to click on the Creality Ender 3 because that's what I have. If you have the Ender 3 Pro, make sure that you're clicking on that. There isn't a huge difference, but there are some small subtle differences, so you want to make sure you're clicking on the correct subtype for your printer. So I'm going to click Next. And now on this page, unless you're following a very specific guide or you know exactly what you're doing, I would just hit Next, because anything you change on this page will drastically change your printer's behavior. So just hit Next. All right, and now you have installed Cura. So from here, what I would do is I go up and I maximize this window to give me a little bit more room to see what I'm doing. Now I'm going to give you a brief overview of how this program works. Top left, we have this file icon up here, or folder icon, I guess. Click on that and it'll bring up the Windows File Explorer. Hit Desktop to be able to find the 3D downloads file that we talked about in the first video. I'm going to go in and grab that same troll model that we worked with in the first video. And now from here, there are two different ways you can add files. You can either highlight this model and then hit Open, or if you had multiple models in here, multiple files, you could highlight all of them and then drag all of them over and drop them inside the print window here. And there you go. Now we have two of that same file. Now you'll see that they're in different orientations here, and that's because whenever you load in multiple files, Cura will try to kind of orient them a little bit, or try to organize them. I shouldn't say orient, because it's not something where it's going to put them in the correct orientation for making them to give you the best quality, or to minimize supports or something like that. There are plugins you can get to do that, but that's something we'll talk about in a different video. Basically for this, what Cura is doing is just trying to make them fit on the build plate as best it can. And now from here, if we click on one of these models, you'll see that all these options on the left here become clickable. So if we don't have anything selected, then we can't do anything with these options. But as soon as you click on a model, you get a couple of different options here of how to manipulate it and how to orient it. And just real quick to explain how I'm navigating, mouse wheel moves in and out. Left mouse button is what you would use to select. Right mouse button allows you to spin your orientation. And if you hold down on the mouse wheel, you can move just in like a one-directional plane up and down or left and right. So that's how I'm kind of maneuvering in here. And it'll seem a little weird at first, especially if you're used to using other three-dimensional programs. This will feel a little weird because they all seem to be just slightly different. But you'll get a feel for it pretty quickly. So now from here, there's a couple of different options we have for manipulating the model. And we're going to go through them real quick here. So the very top one here allows you to move the model in one plane in one direction, back and forth, up and down, left and right, that kind of thing. You can move a model down below the build plate, and what this is going to do is it's going to cut off everything that's below the build plate and print this model as though it were, you know, stuck in quicksand, or if it had somehow gotten melded with the bottom of your build plate, which sounds terrifying. So this can be useful occasionally if there's something that you're trying to do specifically. If you want to go for that kind of look, if you want to have a model that's kind of stuck in the mud or something, you could use this. I think that it's not as precise as using something like Mesh Mixer, so that's what I would recommend going with if there's something specific you want to do. But it's kind of a quick and dirty way to cut a model up if you want to do something like that, because now you're cutting off majority of his back and this back foot and stuff. However, you cannot move the build plate, or you cannot move the model up above the build plate because it will snap back down again. So you can only ever move it so far above before it snaps back down, unless you have some support settings to change that. And you can also move the model by just adding in exact coordinates. So you could move it up and down dependent on how you want to change it. So let's do 50 here, and you'll see it jump to the side. So you can make subtle adjustments if you just wanted to do something by, you know, 1 millimeter increments or even less, you know, if there's something specific that you're going for. I typically don't ever do anything that specific. Like I said, in Cura, usually I'll take it to Mesh Mixer and do more precise editing and then bring it in here. But if there's something just, you know, quick and easy you're trying to change, that can be useful. And then the next one down here is going to be for scaling. So this is going to be if, you know, this troll model is pretty large. So if you decided that you wanted to scale it down a little bit just to kind of fit with your theme, or if the scale of miniatures that you're using is a little bit different than the one that this was made for, that can get kind of tricky as far as keeping proportions correct, but we'll talk about that in another video. But this is a really quick and easy way to scale a model. by just clicking on one of these values and moving it up and down. Moving away from the model, or moving away from the center of the build plate increases the size, moving towards the build plate decreases the size. And anytime you make a mistake, you can always just hit Control-Z, go back to where it was. So you can see here, if you accidentally make it too large and you want to go back, you can just hit Control-Z and that'll take it back to the size it was. But real quick, we'll talk about that. So if a model ever gets grayed out like this, what it's telling you is that it's too large to fit on the build plate. So you have to either cut it up or change the orientation or change its scale so that it fits back down on the build plate and it turns that same yellow color like that. So that lets you know that it is the correct size to be sliced and printed on this build plate. And again, you can add in exact values if that's something that you're going for. If you know generally what you need it to be, then you can add those in here. One thing I will say about this, if you don't have uniform scaling selected, you will stretch the model out in a really weird configuration that makes it look really disproportionate because you're only stretching it in one plane, which makes it look really warped and weird. So unless there's, again, something very specific you're going for, keep uniform scaling selected, otherwise you're going to get a really weird proportion. And then the next one down is going to be for rotating the model. This one is probably, out of all of these, this is the one that I use the most. So a lot of times certain programs will, certain modeling programs, when they export the model, it's in a different plane than Cura considers to be the Z direction, or I think it's the Z. I could be wrong about that. So basically it swaps them. So in certain modeling programs, it considers this to be the correct orientation for this model here on the right. But in Cura, it thinks that this is the correct orientation. So that's why these models are coming in laying on their back. So a lot of times you will have to spin a model around just to get it in the correct position for standing, or what I tend to do a lot of times for supporting and for trying to keep some fine details from getting messed up, or just to get a better print in general, I'll end up turning the model about between 15 and 30 degrees, sometimes 45, but usually I stick to 30 on its back in order to make supporting it a little bit easier and try to get a little bit more of a cleaner finish. So knowing how to spin these models can be really helpful, and you're basically just going to do that by hovering over one of these outer circles here, and then you're just going to left click on it, hold it, and then you can rotate it around. And I definitely encourage you to just play around with all of these different settings and different values and things that you can kind of manipulate or use to manipulate these models, just because the more you do it, the better feeling you're going to get for it. And you can always go back on something, you know, always hit Control-Z and I can put this right back to where it was. So there's no concern there. You can always go back if you make a mistake. But just kind of playing around with these can be a really great way to learn how to kind of do a different type of print, or how to put it in a different orientation that you don't normally use. This one's been a little buggy here and I don't know why. There we go. For some reason it wasn't letting me click on this this red one here. So you might have to finesse it a little bit to get there, but basically you're just going to use these to change its orientation, move it around if you need to change its position for supporting, or like I said, if it comes in laying on its back like that. And I'm actually going to do that to this one here so that we can, or I can show you what the next editing tool is. So I'm going to do this and I'm going to spin this one around. Alright, so both of these trolls are in the same orientation, but let's say you did want to print two of them at the same time. You were going to have maybe an encounter where you're going to have these two trolls come out, or maybe you wanted to have statues on either side of a doorway or something. For me personally as a DM, to make it easier on myself to keep track of certain enemies, or just to kind of give them a little bit more of a unique flair, instead of just changing up the paint scheme that you're going with, you can also use this function here, which is called mirroring. And what this does is it changes the position of the model so that it's a mirror image. So you can see now the claws were on his left arm, now they're on the right, versus on this one they're still on the left arm. So it's an exact mirror image of what it was, and this can just give you a little bit of variety, a little bit of uniqueness if you're going to print more than, you know, one of these models. If you're printing an entire army of them, you're kind of out of luck there. You're going to have to change up your paint scheme, maybe add some different kind of weathering techniques and battle scars and that kind of stuff to kind of give them a little bit more of a unique flair. But this can help a lot to to make them a little bit more unique and help make it easier to keep track of them on your table. And now these last two options have to do with supporting, and we're not going to get into supporting in this video because it is a very large topic. So we're going to save that for a future video. I promise it'll be coming soon. It's a very broad topic, and for me to do it justice, it's going to have to be its own video. So we're going to skip these just for now. But this gives you more than enough so you can kind of get your feet wet, start playing around with these models, and kind of get an idea for how to manipulate models, how to change their scale, do that mirroring technique. Like I said, you can move them around and just sort of start playing around with it. And then once you get them in the scale that you want them in and a position that you think will print well, you can come up to the top right here, and Cura will have some these are basic settings. What I would do is hit custom, and this is going to give you a whole lot more options. So what you can do here is come up top, click on this tab that says standard quality, and you can kind of look at the different qualities here. So if you know anything about 3D printing, you know that quality is measured in millimeters. So you know, a 0.1 millimeter layer height is going to be a bit finer than a 0.15. So you can kind of use that as a judge here, and you can also see here that they say low quality 0.28, standard quality 0.2, dynamic quality 0.16, and so on. What I would recommend is going with, depending on your printer, depending on your configuration, these settings are going to be slightly different. They should all, I think, still have the same names, so superior, dynamic, standard, and low quality. I would recommend going with the second highest quality. That should give you a good balance, at least to start out. That should give you a good balance between the amount of time that something's going to take to print and the amount of quality you're going to get out of it. Because with especially FDM printing, there's kind of two things that you're always going to be fighting with. And that's going to be the amount of time it takes something to print versus the quality that it's going to have. So if you want to have really high quality, you're most likely going to have to take a little bit of a hit when it comes to the printing time. So if you want something to print quickly, you're probably going to take a little bit of a hit when it comes to how much quality it's going to have. So something like terrain, like buildings or trees or something like that, that you don't care as much about, that's not going to be scrutinized as much by you or your players, then you might want to go with a little bit of a lower quality so it prints faster. But something like these that are going to be, you know, they're big monsters, you want them to look great, you want to be able to put paint on them and have them look really fierce. It wouldn't hurt to go with something that's going to be a higher quality so you can get some better detail out of them. But again, I definitely encourage you to play around with this and, you know, print some tests and get an idea for what you're doing. I would just recommend starting with the second highest quality, which in this situation is going to be 0.16. And like I said, the second highest, whatever that might be for you, mine is 0.16, might be different for you, is going to be a good balance between the amount of time that a print is going to take versus the level of detail you're going to get out of it. And I will absolutely show you guys how to tweak those settings later and get better prints later on. But for now, we're just kind of doing what we need to get started and giving you a good basis so you can get started and kind of get a feel for things. And along those lines, what I'm actually going to recommend that you do is, I was using these models as more of an example. These are models that would definitely need supports. I am going to recommend that you go to Thingiverse, and I'll have this link down below, and grab this file. This is the Barkeeper model from Vivictus Miniatures. I'll have all their stuff linked down below. These are really great. This is the Barkeeper model from Vivictus Miniatures, and I will have their stuff linked down below. I definitely recommend you check them out. They have really great models just in general, but what I really like about them is the fact that they're supportless models, or at least I think 90% of their models are. And the reason that that's important is because, like I said before, supports are kind of a different animal. They add a lot of variety as far as what you're able to print, but they also add a pretty hefty learning curve onto this. So I usually recommend that people start off with a model that's a little bit easier and a little bit more user-friendly to start off with, and then you can get into more detailed and more ridiculously posed models in the future that are going to require more specific supports, because this kind of breaks it up a little bit and gives you a chance to get started with something that's not going to be quite so frustrating, because supporting a model and learning support techniques can be a little frustrating and can be time consuming. So we're going to start with something that's going to be pretty easy to print. You can just get it into your slicer, you can slice it up, get it set to go, and then hit print. You don't have to worry about any other aspect. So we're going to download this model, and then you're going to bring it into the slicer just the way that I showed you earlier. So there you go. Now we can kind of see the size comparison here between this this large troll from Yasashi and this smaller Barkeeper model from Vivictus Miniatures. And now if I go down here to slice, what you're going to see Once that finishes processing, it'll give you an estimate for how long this will take to print. It'll also give you a pretty good idea of how much filament it's going to take to print these. But what's most important here is if I hit preview, you can see the models in what's called the layer view. Now this is really useful because it shows you exactly how these models are going to be printed, layer by layer. Over here on the right, you can see the slider, and above it's going to be a number. This is 774. That's telling me how many layers this model was cut into, given the layer height that I specified, which I specified the quality that I wanted it to be at was the second highest for this situation was 0.16. And what I got was a model that's been cut into 774 individual layers. Now, that was a whole lot of information that I just kind of threw out. I'm going to make that a lot easier. So I'm going to zoom in here and we're going to take a look at his hand here. I'm going to grab this slider and I'm going to bring it down to something like, let's just pick an arbitrary number. Let's do 470. So we're going to go down to 470. And that's right here at his forearm. Now if I turn to the side a little bit, you can see all of these different striations here are different layers. Now they're very, very thin to the point that if your printer is well tuned, you can kind of feel them under your finger, but to the naked eye, they're actually kind of hard to see. So if I click on this, make sure that this model is highlighted, and I click on this slider here, I can hit the up arrow and we can actually watch this get built layer by layer. So this kind of gives you a visual representation of why I was saying earlier that higher quality requires more time, because if I kind of hold the button down here and we go up to his wrist, I can show you that you can see how subtly these lines sort of slope down. So this is a bunch of tiny little lines that are creating very small, subtle adjustments here, or subtle changes to create these really pronounced, really detailed curves. And if I did something like, say, change this layer height to double what it is now you can see how much thicker these layers are. And if I scroll up to the top, you can see that instead of having 774, we now have less than half of that. We have 332. So the amount of layers, the amount of distance between those layers has been drastically changed and made much thicker. So the amount of subtle difference that we can have in these layers has been reduced by a lot. So this is where that idea comes in. You can get a visual representation of having a faster print by printing in thicker layers versus having higher quality by printing in thinner layers, therefore giving you a more subtle change and a more detailed topography of the model. And this is back at the 0.16 layer height, and you can again see that there's just much more detail here. So zooming out, we're going to talk a little bit about why I recommended you print this this model, the Barkeeper model, over this Troll model. I love both of these models, and I love both of these artists. Both Vivictus and Hisashi are great artists. I love their stuff, but when you're just starting out, definitely go for supportless models because it's going to be much less of a hassle for you. So first things first, let's start at the base. So if I tip the camera up here a little bit, and we're going to grab that same layer view, we're going to slide it all the way down to the bottom, and we're going to take a look at the very first layer. So right off the bat, you can see a pretty big difference here. So the Barkeeper model is going to print with this very large base, which means it's going to get really good bed adhesion, which basically just means it's going to stick in place. So as the printer is moving this bed back and forth, and the nozzle's moving back and forth in this direction, printing this model, it's not going to get popped off the bed because it's got a really good surface area here that's making a lot of really good adhesion and attaching itself well. Versus this model, you can see this whole big model, even though it's way bigger than this Barkeeper, this is all the more that the first layer is going to be attaching to the build plate. It's just this little part of the toe here, which tells me that this model is not meant to be printed like this. And we could very easily get it to print like this with just a little bit of work, but we're not going to get into that right now. Basically, anytime you're going to be printing, it's always a good idea to use the layer view to go down to the very first layer and see what kind of bed adhesion you're going to have, because quite literally, this is the first layer. Everything's going to build off of this. So if you don't have a good first layer, your model is going to fail 100% of the time. So between these two models, you're going to have well, this whole thing's going to turn into spaghetti, honestly, but if you printed these separately, this one's going to print perfectly, this one not. So it's a really good habit to get into, just to check that first layer, because it only takes a second and it can save you a lot of time and frustration. Now if we tip this view up a little bit, I'm going to show you the next reason why I recommend you go with a supportless model starting out versus one like this, which is going to require some pretty heavy supporting. So if we use that layer view again, we're going to go up until That's right there. So you can see how this model, keep your eye on just this first part of the model here. You can see the way that it builds. Everything is building up from this base. So once the base finishes, then the feet start to get printed. Then once the feet are printed, then the pants start to print, the legs. It all works its way up. So nothing is being built that doesn't have support below it. Versus if you look over here at this model, you can see that this loincloth here is what's called an island. So there's nothing supporting it. It's not attached to any other part of the model, which means that this is going to print in midair, which means that the nozzle is going to extrude filament at the this point here where this loincloth starts, and it's going to stick to the nozzle because it's got nothing to stick to because there's no support below it, and it's not on the build plate. So it's going to stick to the nozzle, and then it's going to drag it over to the next part of the model, either this model or this one, that it's printing out on that layer, and it's going to scrape all that filament off as it's printing. Which, best case scenario, you're going to get some zits on your model and it's going to have some imperfections. Worst case scenario, it catches the model and rips it off the build plate. So it's really just never a good idea to print something that's going to have areas like this that aren't supported, that are just hanging in midair. It's really never going to go well for you. So again, this is why this model over here is going to print perfectly with no supports at all. And I've done this on FDM a ton of times. It's a really great model for this. And while I love this model, it is going to take a lot more supporting. So hopefully that gives you an idea of why I recommend starting with this Barkeeper model, which is supportless. It prints totally on its own, versus something like this Troll, which I love. It's a badass model, but it's going to require a lot more supporting, which, like I said, jumps you into an entirely different learning curve when it comes to 3D printing with FDM, and also for resin, but specifically in this situation we're talking about the FDM printing side of it. So definitely start with these Vivictus models, start with this Barkeeper. I'll have it linked in the description down below. If you like these models, definitely go check out Vivictus and grab yourself some more of these so that you can just kind of print and get a feel for your machine, get a feel for your settings, and then we can talk about support settings in a future video. So what I'm going to do here real quick is select this model and hit delete. Then I'm going to hit right click on the Barkeeper and hit center selected model, which is going to do exactly what it sounds like. It's going to pull it into the center of the build plate. And real quick, we can run through these options. So center selected, we saw what that did. Delete, obviously that makes sense. Multiply selected model, if you click on that, you can specify how many multiples you want it to have. Then we're going to have select all models, arrange all models. Again, this is the same thing I was saying before, where if you added a bunch of models and you arranged them a little bit in a way that you thought would be would print well, or you thought that they would all fit, but you want to see if Cura has a better way of trying to sort of organize them in a way that they might fit better, you can try that option. It does a pretty good job of fitting things onto the build plate, which is, like I said, really all it is. It's not putting it in an orientation that's going to print better, it's just trying to fit it onto the build plate. Clear build plate, obviously, reload all models. So most of these are pretty straightforward. And again, like I said, play with any of this stuff. You're not going to break the program, I don't think, but, you know, probably not. So just kind of play around with it, get a feel for it. But once you have your Barkeeper model in here, once you have your second to highest quality set, you're going to hit slice. And then once that's done slicing your model, you can hit the preview to take a look at it if you want to see the layer view again. And then you can go down here and see that it's giving you an estimate of 1 hour and 20 minutes until it's done. And it's telling you that it's going to take 4 grams of filament, which, again, these are estimates. They're close sometimes, but they're not always the most accurate. So kind of take them with a grain of salt. But from here, you can hit Save File. It's going to bring out that same file explorer. And now from here, what I recommend we do, create another folder on our desktop, which we're going to call SD card ready. And the reason that I'm doing that is because most 3D printers do use an SD card. You're going to pop that into your computer, you're going to load your slice files onto the SD card, then you're going to put it back into your printer, find the files, and then you're going to hit print. So I'm going to open up this file and I'm going to save this in there. But real quick, we're going to change the title of this file. So we can call it whatever we want. It's still calling it the Troll because that's the first model that I brought in. So that's what Cura is calling it. But I'm going to call it Barkeeper. And there's one other thing that I'm going to do here. So I'm going to put 1.20 in the title. And the reason that I'm doing that is because a lot of times your printer, depending on the way that it's set up, depending on the printer that you have, it will tell you how much time has elapsed, so how much time it's been since you started a print, but it won't tell you how long until a print is done. So there are some models out there that do that, but most of the ones that I've had, they don't tell you how much time until it's done, they tell you how much time since you started. So what I do is I put in the title how long a print, or how long Cura says that a print will take. Again, like I said, that's an estimate. It can be a bit longer, a bit shorter, usually longer. So I put it in the title just so that I can look at the title of the file as it's printing, and I can say, okay, it's been printing for an hour, it should be done in about 20 minutes to half an hour, whatever it might be. So it's just kind of a little trick. You don't have to do that, but just wanted to explain why you're seeing me do that. It gives me an idea for how long that model might take to print. And then I'm going to hit save. Alright, so we're almost done, but this video has been pretty dense with info, so maybe you want to take a minute and walk around, pet your dog, your cat, your significant other, whatever it might be. Just take a minute to kind of take a breath and let your brain relax and kind of recover a little bit from all that information we just crammed into it. Alright, so now that we feel a little bit more refreshed, there's really only two other things that I wanted to talk about. I doubt you're going to need either of them, but we're going to go over them real quick just in case. So the first one is going to be up here where it says Creality Ender 3. If you click on that, this is where you can add another printer. So if you had, maybe you have a friend who has a printer and they don't have access to a computer, you want to slice models for them, or if you get two printers just starting out because you don't realize that that's not a great idea, but you know, or maybe you just are really excited about 3D printing. If so, more power to you. So you can hit add printer and it's going to bring up that same screen as before. And this is where you can add another printer just the same way we did before. And then when you click on this tab, you'll have multiple printers in here instead of one, and you can click through them depending on which printer you're going to slice files for. Alright, so the next one's going to be this big bar in the center, and this is for if you decide to print with a different type of filament or a different size nozzle. Now, neither of these are something that I recommend doing when you're first starting out. I would stick with PLA and I would stick with the 0.4 nozzle that's pretty common on most printers, but if this is something you want to jump into, this is where you would change that. I'm not going to get into this right now because, like I said, these are the most new user-friendly options, so just stick with these for now, especially if you're new. But that's pretty much all I wanted to go over with Cura, so we're going to jump out of this now. And now from here, you can definitely delete this installer off your desktop because you don't really need that anymore. Alright, so with that, we are at the end of this video. Hopefully, after watching this, you now know how to download, install, and configure Cura for your specific printer. If you run into any issues or you have any questions, feel free to post them down below, or join the Facebook group and post them there. So one last thing before I sign off, I want to give you a homework assignment. You don't have to do this, but I would appreciate it. I'd like you to bring a model into Cura. I want you to slice it and then go into that layer view. From there, I want you to get a screenshot of, it can be the first layer, it can be the last layer, or anything in between. I want you to get a picture of that layer view. And then I want you to post it into the Sliceprintroleplay Facebook group. From there, me and the other members will welcome you to an awesome hobby and congratulate you on taking the first steps into this awesome 3D printing adventure. So hopefully you found this video helpful. If you did, please like and subscribe. It really does help the channel and I really do appreciate it. If you want to support the channel, you can join my Patreon, or you can just share this video with your friends. That helps a lot too. Alright, let's go print something.